Hello and welcome to today's video. It is on the immune response and defense against disease. So the learning goals for today are to firstly understand how pathogens can cause both physical and chemical changes in a host and how this can stimulate an immune response. We'll recognize that plants and animals have these two responses. There's the innate response, and then there's the adaptive response to a pathogen. We'll recall that the innate immune response is made up of barriers such as skin and mucus, and also systems such as the inflammation and the complement system. We'll talk a little more on the other side, the other system, and that was the adaptive immune response. And this is an explained cognitive verb, which means we need to go into more detail here. And we'll talk about the production of antibodies through the B cells, and we'll also talk about T cells and what they do. We'll describe the inflammatory response, analyze the different types of immunity and how they can be obtained, and lastly, we'll recall examples of how plants have their own defense mechanisms, and that being physical, such as barriers, but also their chemical defense strategies. So here you can pause the video and just write some kind of summarized version of these learning goals down in your books. Cool, so let's get into it. First up, let's talk about stimulating an immune response. So what happens when you have any kind of infection by a virus or other type of pathogen is that it gains entry inside our cells. It's breached that outermost physical defense, like our skin and our mucous membranes. Once it's in our cells, it uses the machinery of our cells, talking viruses, to make copies of itself until it destroys that cell and then infects or many other cells. If it weren't for our immune system, we would be devastated by all the pathogens that are around us. So we have to have protection. To be able to defend ourselves from invasion by pathogens, we need to be able to distinguish, though, what belongs to us and what is foreign. We must be able to tell what is self and what is non-self. And that might seem like a bit of a strange question, but it's a very important concept in helping us to maintain our health and not attacking ourselves. And when something does invade us, to recognize it and to attack it. So a substance that triggers an immune response is called an antigen. Both plants and animals are alerted to the invasion of bacteria and viruses by physical and chemical changes that can occur in our cells and in our tissues. An antigen is anything foreign, and here is a picture. It's, in this case, a bacterial cell, and it has these proteins on the surface of it. These proteins are antigenic determinants, or simply just antigens. So to fight this pathogen, we produce antibodies, and an antibody has this kind of Y-shape looking structure, and the name antigen is simply short for antibody generator. In other words, we recognize these antigens as foreign on foreign material when it enters our body, and so we produce our defense system against that, which are antibodies. So what are antibodies? They are proteins produced by our body, and basically all look similar. They have this cool shape to them. We produce almost an infinite amount, but they all have different shapes up the top. We're only going to produce the shape for the one thing that we are infected by when we're infected. We know what shape to make because when we've been infected by it before, we have these cells that have this memory that remember that shape and so produce the according looking antibody. And what happens is that antibody, when it recognizes that foreign invasion again, it will actually dock to the antigen. And what it does is it marks it so that macrophages, that's our white blood cells, they will find it. When they find it, they either destroy it by ingesting it or simply just breaking it down. And when these antibodies dock to a pathogen, not only do they mark it, but they can just dock all around it and surround it, physically making it just much harder for that bacterial or viral cell to do whatever it was going to do. We're now going to look at how once this has happened in our body, like what kind of immune response is triggered. So we're going to zoom out of this current mode of presentation, and I'm going to do a bit of a sketch. So I'll see you there. Okay, so let's get into it. We are going to talk the immune response. So when a pathogen is trying to attack our body, what's going to take place? Well, there's two pathways. There's two types of main responses that can occur. The first one we're going to say is called the innate response. So innate means it's something that we're born with, and it doesn't matter what type of pathogen or infection that's trying to enter our body. It doesn't matter what type it is, it's going to be the same response over here regardless. So it's also called the non-specific response. It's also called the non-specific response. And there are a few kind of components to this. The first component is the barriers. So before it can get into our body, it has to get past our physical barriers, and that can include our skin, which is coated in keratin. It's this protein that provides waterproofing, but we also have mucous membranes, and they coat our respiratory tracts, our nasal passageways, as well as our bronchi and bronchioles. So if a pathogen does get in, it can be trapped in that mucus and then blown out or coughed up. We also have not just physical barriers, but we have chemical barriers. And these chemical barriers include, say, like the digestive enzymes in our gut. So if we ingest something that wasn't cooked properly, it's a highly acidic environment in our stomach due to that hydrochloric acid. So we have digestive enzymes which are going to break that pathogen down. As well as chemical barriers, we have the inflammatory response. And this is something we're going to talk a lot more about really soon. So this is basically our first line. These ones over here, we could say the chemical and the physical barriers are the first line of defense. This, once it just makes it past that skin, we also have the inflammatory response, which is the second line of defense. So if we're talking in an analogy right now, say if we have like an invading army and they're trying to come up and attack back in medieval times, the first thing they're going to have to do is get past the castle, right? So the castle is going to be, it's going to have to get past the wall of the castle. And that can be like the barriers. So we've got the wall, but once they come up to the wall, maybe we have soldiers who are going to pour like hot chemicals such as tar over the wall to stop those invaders from getting in. But then we also have the inflammatory response. And so say that the invading army has made it up to the wall and they've actually breached the gate. this is when we're going to have the infantry come in. This is going to be like the soldiers, and we're going to talk about this in terms of white blood cells and how they would just invade those pathogens, that foreign material, before it can have too much influence on our body. So this is the innate response. This is something we're born with, and it doesn't matter what type of pathogen it is, it's going to be the same response regardless. The opposite to this is, well, it's the adaptive immune response. And this is something that is more complex, and it's in vertebrates, and it is specific. So this means that, well, it depends what type of pathogen that it is infecting our body, and if we know it, what the response will be. So it's also called the acquired response. And what this involves is created memory. And it involves two main types of cells. We have B cells, and we also have what are called T cells. And B cells are produced, this is where the B comes from, it's produced in our bone marrow. So that's the spongy part, the most inner part of our bones. It's made in our bone marrow, and these B cells are so important in producing what are called antibodies. And we said that's this Y-shaped feature, and they're produced in response to, say, a pathogen, say this bacteria or this virus, which has these proteins on the outside called antigens. And so when we're first exposed to that pathogen, we see that these proteins are foreign, and so these B cells produce antibodies in response to them. And we said that those antibodies will dock to those pathogens, those antigens, and literally mark it for destruction, for white blood cells to come and engulf that pathogen. And they also just dock all around it so that they can't perform even their function. They can't do what they want to do. And this happens in the humours of our body, in the fluids between cells. So it's called the humoral response. So that means it happens between our cells. It's happening in the fluid. And if we're going back to the medieval kind of analogy, this is like the brute force. But over here, we're talking intelligence. We're talking, say we've got like spies, and just to help us draw a spy, I'm drawing like someone with a tuxedo here. It's with a black tie and some glasses, but it's our intelligence, it's our memory. So when we're first exposed to a pathogen, we create these antibodies. So if we ever get that again, we remember and we instantly produce it. That's why we don't get so sick from something the second time we have it. Over here we have the T cells, and they're called T cells because they are made, let's go green again, they are made in the thymus. And what they do is it's called the cell mediated response. So that means once that pathogen has actually made it into our cells, say it's infected, we've got this bacteria or this virus, and it's docked onto our cells and it's injected it, and now that virus is just multiplying within our cells. The T cells, which are also called natural killer cells, they come in, and then they simply terminate it, they wipe it out. And this process is also called apoptosis, of terminating a cell. So this is the two types of responses that our body can go through. We have the brute force, the innate system, but also the adaptive response. So what we're going to talk more about now is this, the inflammatory response. We're talking the innate system. Okay, so now we are going to talk the inflammatory response. And this is part of the innate system. It's general. It doesn't matter what kind of pathogen it is. The same thing is going to take place. So if you've ever had a splinter or some kind of abrasion, you would know that there is swelling that takes place. There is also redness that you start to notice. You can also feel heat, and you can also feel pain, and these are often signs of injury, but we know that this is a sign of healing, and our body's doing what it needs to do. So there's a few kind of things that I want to discuss in this whole process. We're going to talk about mast cells and what they do. As well as that, we're going to discuss what are prostaglandins. Prostaglandins, think back to our learning goal, why we're talking about these. Prostaglandins and histamines. And we're also going to talk about, lastly, phagocytes. So I'm going to come to these terms at the end because we're going to start with a picture. And say you've got your skin, right? You've got these epithelial cells that make up your skin. They're covered in microflora, bacteria. But then in your skin there is a break. We have some kind of like splinter or knife or needle that it's probably killed a few cells. It's probably damaged a few more. But what is also on that splinter is all these little bacteria, and they're now affecting our body. They're getting into the nearby tissues. So there's an invasion. There's a few steps now that are going to start taking place, and let's start with number one. What's going on already? Well, we have bacteria. We have bacteria that can invade cells. So that's the first thing that's happening. Now we're going to talk about what our body is going to start doing to prevent further injury, to prevent further infection. And so I want to introduce you to mast cells. Mast cells are these cells that are strategically placed all throughout our tissues, and they contain these chemicals called prostaglandins and histamines. So these mast cells detect that there's an injury, and so what they do is they release these chemicals. They release these histamines and these prostaglandins. Histamines, prostaglandins are secreted. They're secreted. And what they do is a very important job. So third thing that they're going to do is what is called, they firstly cause vasodilation, and they cause increased permeability of a blood vessel. So let's draw that. Say you've got a blood supply here, right? What happens is, instead of it being like a really narrow, small blood vessel, when histamines and prostaglandins are released, they are going to widen that blood vessel, going to make it wider near the injured site. But the reason why I'm drawing this in a dotted line is because they also increase the permeability of the blood vessel. So I can add that in here. These histamines, 1, 2, 3, step 3, they increase permeability of blood vessels, small blood vessels, and they stimulate, they increase vasodilation. That means it's this widening. So instead of the blood vessel being normally very small, it increases it and makes it more permeable. That means things can like pass out of it more easily. And this is often associated with swelling and pain and redness because you're getting more heat, more blood to that site. So what is actually going to be happening there is these things are going to be coming to the site because this blood supply is just amped up so much more. Let's call this step 4. We have the clotting cascade that starts to come into play. So different things come out, and we have like fibrin. So this is going to start like repairing the damaged site. But also we have coming in the blood supply a greater supply of like white blood cells or phagocytes to start doing what they need to do. And also just other proteins are going to start coming into this region through this increased blood supply because of histamines and prostaglandins. And that leads us on to step 5. So step 5 is now we have a whole bunch of white blood cells. So when white blood cells ingest things, they're doing phagocytosis. So we call them phagocytes. Phagocytes engulf bacteria. And that is step 5. So if we were to summarize everything that we just looked at, we can say, well, we have mast cells, which are located in tissues. They're located in tissues, and they, in their cytoplasm contains histamines, and just shorthand this, and prostaglandins. So what do histamines, prostaglandins do? Well, histamines and prostaglandins, they are chemicals. They are chemicals which increase vasodilation of blood, and they also increase permeability of the blood supply. And this is so that we get what we need at that site to that site, including white blood cells. So these, a subclass of white blood cells are monocytes, and also neutrophils. And they're just these type of white blood cells that they engulf bacteria through phagocytosis. They engulf the bacteria. And so that is the process of inflammation, and it's often noted by swelling, redness, heat, and pain through these 5 steps. I hope you found that useful. Okay, so welcome back. We just looked at how the immune system can be broken up into the innate and the adaptive system. The innate immune system, we said, is non-specific, and you don't create any immunological memory to pathogens. The adaptive system, however, is specific, and you do create immunological memory to specific pathogens. So let's talk about immunity. So how do we create or acquire this immunological memory? Well, there are 4 different ways, and we can break these 4 different ways into 2 major types. They are active and passive. So we'll talk about each one of these now. Let's talk about the big category, active immunity, first. So active processes mean you yourself create the immunological memory. That means you make the antibodies. You can do this in 2 ways. One where it is naturally acquired, and the other where it is artificially acquired. Naturally means you get something from the environment, like a pathogen, and you create antibodies to it. Artificial means you get exposed to that pathogen through artificial means, and the most common type being the vaccine. For example, people back in the 1950s were exposed and dying to polio, but now we have a vaccine where we can expose people to an inactivated form of it, but where the antibodies are still created when we see it. So when we are really exposed to it, our body then recognizes that pathogen and immediately breaks it down. So when something is passive, if we're talking passive immunity, it means you're not doing anything about it yourself. You're simply receiving antibodies that have already been made. So how does this happen? Well, again, it can be broken down into natural and artificial. And natural doesn't mean the best way. It simply means it's coming from environmental natural sources. So naturally acquired passive immunity can be in the form of antibodies passed through from the mother to the baby, and this can be through either breast milk or it can be through the placenta. So natural environmental sources. Whereas it can also be passed on artificially. And artificial acquired passive immunity is where these antibodies are already generated in someone else, and they can be injected through like blood, plasma, transfusions, and this is helpful in different types of infections and prevention, in terms of like tetanus and rabies. So to summarize everything we just spoke about, there's immunity, and it can be either active, where you create the antibodies yourself, or it can be passive, where you receive them from someone else. Both can either be natural from environmental sources, or artificial, being from other non-environmental sources. So that is acquired immunity, and we're going to go on now to look at how plants can actually have their own defense mechanisms. So in plants, just like humans and animals, plants are also prone to attack, so they must have ways in which to prevent themselves from things such as parasites, pests, and to prevent themselves from bacteria and viruses, pests and parasites, and fungi as well. So we depend on plants for many things, including like food and medicine and oxygen. So understanding how plants work, and therefore how to protect them, is important for us as a human race also. So we can break up defense strategies in plants into two main categories. We have physical barriers, which can include like the thorns on the leaves of cacti, or we can look at thorns on this acacia. But we can also look at chemical strategies in plants. So this foxglove produces several deadly chemicals that can, even in us, cause nausea and vomiting and hallucinations. Physical barriers in plants are the first line of defense, and it can also include like thick outer bark as well as waxy cuticles on leaves, which provide protection against fungal and bacterial infections. Whereas chemical strategies include the production of what are called defensins, which are small, stable antimicrobials. They're so small, they inhibit the development of fungi and bacteria, viruses and insects. And we've also harnessed the power of these in for ourselves, like the bitter tasting tannins, which we use in tea, give tea its color and its taste, as well as we use coffee and cocoa. These are both toxic to insects and fungi produced by plants. And then there's also pyrothins, which are compounds produced by the chrysanthemum flower, and they act as neurotoxins to insects. So these are a few strategies in plants. We have physical defense strategies, that's like thorns, waxy cuticles, as well as chemical defense strategies such as defensins and the production of toxins. All this is in response to pathogens so that plants may remain protected themselves. So that is all for today. But as always, for homework, jump into the textbook. It's chapter 15 and it's a bit of a big one, but just break it down and add those keywords to your glossary. I hope that this video has been informative and helpful, and I will see you guys in class. Goodbye.